Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on developing your organization's systemic true north. My name is Jody Basson. I'm the founder of MasterStart, and with me today I've got Dr. Tineke Wulffers. Dr. Wulffers, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jody.
How are you today?
I am very well and very excited about sharing what we will be sharing in the next hour or so. Looking forward to the questions.
Yeah, no, I'm also looking forward to talking to you. Dr. Wulffers, can you give us some insight into the areas you work in and your background?
So Jody, I work both in the professional and the academic fields. Professionally, as a leadership coach, I focus on the development of individual and collective authentic leadership effectiveness for individuals and teams and organizations. And I work both locally and overseas, globally. And then academically, I have a master's in professional coaching with the University of Middlesex in the UK, and I also have a PhD in personal professional leadership, where I focused once again on how one develops individual and collective authentic leadership effectiveness. And I work at various business schools in South Africa and lecture, supervise, examine, etc. So that's what I keep myself busy with.
Great, thank you. Dr. Wulffers, to jump into the discussion, becoming future fit in a post-COVID-19 world, can you give us some context on, what you mean by becoming future fit?
Yeah, so Jody, I think two months ago, I had no idea COVID-19, what does that even mean, and post-COVID-19 world. So our world has changed very quickly and very drastically. And I woke up a couple of weeks ago, I woke up one night, in the middle of the night, and I sort of heard this conversation between COVID-19 and the world. And COVID-19 asking the world, what on earth do you think you are doing? And so not surprisingly, the world responded and said, well, I'm so busy with doing, I don't have time to think. And COVID-19 thought about it and said, I think I can help you with that. And isn't that exactly what's happened, Jody? Because the world's come to a standstill almost. So let's have a look at that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Why are we here today? I thought, the world will most probably never be the same again. And so what we want to make sure of is that in the way it's going to change, let's make sure it changes for the better. So imagine being able to tell a post-COVID story, your story, beyond whatever you could have imagined possible. And I'm talking about you. You could be, anyone from an individual sole proprietor to a small business, to a big corporate, to corporate organization, academic organization, political organization. Imagine if you could actually find a new way of working. And what is the story then that you would like to tell in a while that you never ever now or even a month ago thought possible? If you individually and collectively could achieve that, what would that mean for you and your team, your organization, and even for the world that your children will inherit? So let's see today how we can get there. So I'm a great admirer of Otto Sharma from the Presencing Institute, and he writes he has very interesting thoughts. And recently I saw with the COVID pandemic, I saw an article or a blog of his where he actually, so he's the founder of the Presencing Institute, and he offers 8 emerging lessons, which he calls From Coronavirus to Climate Action. And if you think about it, if you look at the first lesson, he says that the coronavirus is a disruption, that the disruption is a harbinger of things to come. And if you think about it, we've been talking for years about the CO2 emissions and that, international flights and flying needs to be reduced drastically. And it's just been talk. And in the last month, or slightly more. I'd say in the last month, I mean, there's hardly any flying. So we're going to have to look at what are the personal sacrifices we have to make, and we're going to have to start looking at moving from egocentric to ecocentric. So that's his first lesson. He also says that your behavior, and of course it's collective and individual, does affect the systems that you're part of. So we need to start looking at mindful behavior that will protect the systems. He also says, therefore, he reminds us there are two levers. We need to change our individual and collective behavior. And the first thing is we need timely government responses. And if we look just at the COVID-19 pandemic, look at the government responses, compare, for instance, Trump's government to Ramaphosa's government, and look at how they've responded in terms of timeliness. And then combined with government response, government is not enough. We need the database citizens awareness, and we need to make sure that citizens actually collectively and individually become aware of how they need to respond and change their behavior as well, which we've had to do in South Africa and also globally. And then finally, most important, we individually and collectively are faced with a choice of how to respond. And we can either be in denial and freeze and take care only of ourselves, or we can embrace and turn to others, give and receive support for the greater good and for a better future. So for me, those first four lessons really stood out for me. And, if we talk about our systems, Jody, we're talking about, okay, so we start as individuals, and as individuals, we form part of bigger systems. For instance, in organizations, individuals form part of teams, so there's always the interpersonal team dynamics, and teams, again, have their shared purposes, their shared teams, tasks, objectives, strategies, etc. And those teams, again, form part of organizations, and those organizations have stakeholders. The teams also have stakeholders within their organizations, but also outside. And I just want to give you an example of a telecoms company that I've done work with, where they forgot that their customers were part of their stakeholders. And funny enough, when they realized that they had forgotten about their customers, I thought myself, I used to be a customer of yours. I'm no longer, for exactly that reason. And of course, our stakeholders go beyond the stakeholders within the organizations. We also need to look at outside the wider systemic environment. And there I remind you of PESEL. PESEL meaning we've got the political stakeholders, that, with other words, they will influence the outcomes for us. We've got to bear them in mind. We've got to bear in mind economic considerations. We've got to bear in mind societal considerations, technological considerations, legislative considerations, and then also, of course, the environment, always remembering the environment. So those are all the systems that we need to be mindful of. So what Otto Sharma says, he is very well known for his Theory U. He has a lovely book that was published in about 2007, 2008, where he introduces Theory U. And here you can see an upside down U. So he says there are two responses to disruption. The one response is when you come from ego, when you freeze, and there you can see, if you look from the bottom left up, he says, like let's look at Trump, for instance, and his government and the corona pandemic. The first response might be denial. Now, this is not happening. This is not our problem. And actually just sticking to the way that they were always thinking, ignoring the virus for a long time, because they took a long time to respond, desensing and holding on to what they believe, what they think, and just becoming absent during this time. And then what happens is when they realize that they can no longer do that, they become manipulative, They start blaming others. I remember Trump saying this is a China problem or a China virus or Chinese virus, and becoming abusive, saying we're going to disrupt, we don't like what the World Health Organization is saying, we're going to withdraw any funding to the World Health Organization, which can eventually lead to violence and self-destruction. So what that then leads to is a closed mind, which is an ignorant mind, that further then leads to a closed heart, and that which can also manifest in hate, and a closed will, where they're coming from a place of fear. So if you think in the case of Trump, Trump has actually said, I'm not closing down, I'm not locking down, this virus is not happening. I need to keep my economy going. That's how I got voted in, and I'm going to focus on that. So it was an absolute fear-based decision. An interesting thing is, elections are scheduled for later this year, and I'm not sure when they're happening now, but for exactly that response, he might actually be voted out. So what is the other response? Is the U response. And the U response, the theory U, the U here, you can see the U the right way around, is you move to ecocentric and you embrace what's happening. And by embrace, I mean you fully, you say, well, how are we, if you look at the top left of the U, how are we normally operating? And then let's look at that. And let's actually stop for a moment and suspend the way we normally do things and stop and pause and see what's happening around us. And Jody, if you think about it, since you've gone to lockdown, I don't know about you, but I have stopped and I've actually seen things I've never seen before. Even at my own home, I didn't know there were so many birds in my garden.
Right.
I'm seeing them, I'm hearing them, I'm seeing things and I'm hearing things that I was too busy before to actually notice. And then being able to say, well, now that I see things and I see what's happening and I hear what's happening also in our world, I can start saying, well, which of these are working and which are no longer working? I can start sensing and co-sensing with others. How do we need to move in a new direction? What is it that we need to let go of? If you look further down the U, what is it that we need to let go of? And just stop in the present moment and say, what do we need to let go of so that we can go up the U on the right hand side and let come new and different ways, because we cannot continue the way we have. So what are the things that we need to let come in? New beliefs, new thoughts, new ways of doing things. And as we crystallize what is it that we need to let go of and what is it that we need to let come, then start enacting those. Start even identifying what are the behavioral indicators that will show us that we are now enacting a new purpose, a shared purpose for the greater good of all. And then start experimenting with that, prototyping that, embodying it. And in that way, we can start co-creating in a way that's evolutionary, because that's what we need, renewal and evolution. And that then is what allows us, to have an open mind. If you look in the middle of the U from the top down, that open mind. And if you think of Ramaphosa and the South African government, I've seen them actually embracing, I've seen them have an open mind, consulting widely, being curious, learning, and through that, looking at the bigger picture, looking from the outside in, having compassion for people that are suffering, and actually having an open heart, and also having the courage and an open will to start doing things in the way that we never imagined possible a month ago even. So Jody, so that is the theory U today, linking it specifically to COVID-19 that I wanted to introduce. And I wonder at this point if there's some questions before we start moving on.
So just before I ask you a question, if anybody has anything to ask Dr. Wulffers, please pose your questions on the chat and we'll address them through the discussion. Dr. Wulffers, my first question is, you used the example of Trump and the US government. and they were on the upside down view.
Yeah.
You give as an example, how would they actually get off that upside down view and onto the theory view with a trajectory that would obviously be a lot more favorable?
That's a very interesting question, Jody. I want to introduce the notion of leader development readiness. Because all of us, whether we're in leadership positions or whether we leader by presence, we are leaders and we can be leaders. But for a leader to actually evolve, because that's what we're talking about, there needs to be leader development readiness. And that there are two components that make up leader development readiness. The first one is the cognitive ability to be able to reflect, introspect, and to actually start seeing and sensing, what is it that needs to change, and so there's the cognitive ability that we need, and the other thing is the psychological willingness to say, I need to change. So it's almost that appropriate vulnerability. I call it strength-based vulnerability, that we can recognize that we need to change. So if I think of Trump, if you think about fundamentalism, often fundamentalists, they just dig in deeper. They not necessarily prepared to say, well, we need to change. They will just dig deeper and say, I'm sticking to my beliefs. So is Trump able to change? He might be able to, but is he willing? So far, I would say he comes very much from an egocentric space, from what I've seen, and I'm not sure that he would necessarily change. This country would have to find a different solution. I would say. I don't know if that answers your question, Jody.
It does. I've got another question from Mario Roos, saying, how would you recommend as business leaders we motivate our staff in a remote setting?
I think that always one of the things, especially if I look at authentic leadership as well, which I'll talk about on a future webinar, we need to be the change that we wish to see in the world. And in order to see the change, that's the one thing. And the other thing is people will need to want to change. So I think the wonderful thing about coaching, you can't tell people they must change. You've got to help people understand that there are consequences to staying where they are. And in fact, the way to help them understand is to ask them, about their current reality, to ask them what are they seeing and what are they sensing, what is working, what's not working, what would be the consequences if we continue like we are, and what could be the upside if we could find a new way. With other words, what would be the consequences if we stick to what we do? What would be the upside if we can let go of what doesn't work and let come better ways of working? The important thing, though, is, Jody, for me, in my experience, one of the most effective ways of making that happen is to actually coach people, with other words, to listen to what their current realities are and to ask them what they think would be a different way of working. Often people have the most incredible ideas, and unless you ask them, they won't share. I don't know if that answers the question.
Oh, thank you. One more question. Philomena's asked, the approach that the South African government has taken, do you see that as an advantage economically for South Africa?
That's an interesting question as well, because I've watched the South African government with fascination. What I'm seeing in the South African government under the leadership of Ramaphosa, he's a very astute businessman, I believe, and so there's been a little bit of a balancing act between saving lives and saving the country health-wise, and on the other hand, saving the economy. Because so it's almost a question of, would we rather let people die of COVID or let them die of hunger? So he's done a very interesting thing. He's not said either or. He's done both and all the time. How do we protect the lives of our citizens which if COVID-19 goes out of control, it could wipe us out at such a pace, and that will wipe the economy as well. How do we actually first put measures in place to protect our people health-wise and life-wise, and then at the same time, how do we protect our economy? And I think he's doing both. I'm fascinated by when he addresses the nation. I'm fascinated by how he is keeping that balancing act. And I don't envy him for the responsibility that he has on his shoulders, Jody. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it definitely does. Doctor, I think let's move on to the second part of our discussion and discuss how we implement these things practically.
Yeah, okay, so let's move on. So this theory here is a very grand, I think, model, but how do we unpack and how do we operationalize? So if we take this grand initiative and we translate it, I'm going to talk a little bit about effective systemic organizational team development, Jody, because whether you are in an academic organization, a political organization, a corporate organization, you normally have teams. You have systems, and you have systems within systems. You have stakeholders. Sometimes you have 13 fairies. Those are the stakeholders that you forgot to think about, and then you find out why you should have thought about them. So let's have a look at effective systemic team development. And it's based on Professor Peter Hawkins, who is a very well known for his theories on systemic team coaching, and he's a professor at the Henley School of Business in the UK. Let's look at what he suggests. So we always, as teams, we need to look from the future back. We need to, and in this case with COVID-19, we need to look at how do we deal with the pandemic at the moment, but what about life post that pandemic? We need to look beyond that, because that life is never going to be again like it was. We're going to have to look future back, and we're going to have to look at outside in. So from the outside, what is required of us systemically, and from the inside back out. So I'm going to look at that. So, and the question that we need to ask is, what do we need to do together to meet the needs of the greater systems that we form part of now and in the future? And what is it that we need to do together that we cannot do apart? That's very important, because if we can do them apart, then we shouldn't be a team. So as a team, what do we need to do together to meet the needs of the greater system now and in the future that we could not do apart? So it's based a little bit on his work. So I'm going to introduce, because I love this framework, it's so comprehensive, the 5 disciplines of systemic team development. So I'm going to remind you just that we're going to look from the outside in. We start off by what does the team need to sort of look at from the outside. And what are the tasks that are required? And then to the left, I'm moving anti-clockwise. I'm moving from the top left, from the left, we're going to say, so inside the team, what is it that needs to happen in terms of tasks, etc. And then we've moved down, we say, and what has to happen inside the teams from a people process point of view? And then how do we connect again with outside? So you see all these blank spaces. So let's fill them up. So from the top left is a team needs to ask, why are we here? Okay, what are the expectations from our key well, first of all, who are our key stakeholders? And again, that pestle that you see there, politically, economically, societal, technological, legislative, environmental. Who all are our stakeholders, and who are the 13 fairies that we must not forget about? And I gave you an example earlier on of the telecommunications company that forgot that their customers are their key stakeholders. And what are their expectations on what we as a team must deliver? So that's from outside in, and that also is a little bit task focused. So then we can say, so what does that mean? Clarifying for us, what should be our team's primary shared purpose that we all need to pull together to stay true to. Therefore, if you unpack that into our objectives, our strategies, our operations, how they deliver it, systems and risks, that is the stuff that teams normally look at, but they don't necessarily first go and look at who are the key stakeholders that have commissioned them to exist. So inside the team now, once we've clarified our shared purpose, objective strategies, etc., how are we going to co-create together as a team? Interpersonally, what do our team dynamics need to look like? What does our team culture need to look like within our organization? And team culture being the way we do things around here. Interesting here, Jody, is that I find that in organizational development and learning and development, that often people look at individuals and they focus on individuals. Here we're saying, don't forget to look at the spaces between the individuals. You can have two perfectly capable individuals, or you can have a team that comprises capable individuals. But what are the spaces between them looking like? Do they trust one another? Do they engage in healthy conflict together, but not conflict about each one another or each other as people, but about what it is, so that healthy debate or discussions. Do they commit together towards their shared purpose? Do they hold themselves and one another accountable to stay true to achieving that purpose? And are they focusing on the results together? So those are the people processes. And of course, let's not forget then, if we move out of the team again, how are we as a team connecting and engaging with all our key stakeholders? And I'm talking not only about the stakeholders that require things from us as a team, but also the stakeholders that we depend on. Our service providers, for instance, for one, our outsourcing, our consultants. So how do we connect with them in a way also that those connections work, they are productive, they are empowering, so that we can stay true to what it is that we need to achieve. And you know what? The final pillar or discipline is core learning. If you think about just this last month, how we've had to be adaptable and agile, how we've all had to move from face-to-face working to virtual working. Core learning is so important. Are we continually reflecting? Are we making time to reflect? Are we learning and integrating our learnings so that we do remain fit for purpose, adaptable, agile? Remember that conversation with COVID-19 and the world initially, when the world said, I'm too busy. We need to actually take time out to reflect and to learn and to integrate, Jody. So using this framework, we can actually help teams and organizations to actually implement the theory U. What is it that we need to let go of? What is it that we need to let come? How are we going to make sure we can operationalize that? How do we make sure that we can evolve and co-create together? So how do we do that? I find that systemic team development, for that kind of work, we do need a coaching modality, in my experience. And what systemic team coaching does, it's a process by which, I see I've got here a team coach, but normally we use at least 2 team coaches to work with a whole team, both when that team is together and when they are apart. And in order to help teams to improve their collective performance and how they work together, and also how they develop their collective leadership, because everyone in that team is a leader, to more effectively engage with their stakeholder groups. So, and the whole purpose, Jody, is to jointly transform the wider systems that they form part of. And I think at this point, I'm going to ask you if there are any further questions.
So there's a little discussion going on between Fadil and Loda on the chat, and it centers around the work-home balance while working at home. Because What happened over this last period with coronavirus is that we've rushed into this sort of new normal of working from home,
Yes.
and a lot of us, I know for myself as well, I've been working so many hours outside even of the norm when I used to drive to work and drive home. My work day has just increased exponentially. And, from a team perspective and a management perspective, how do we actually manage that work-home balance for our teams and our employees?
That's again a very good question, and I'm going to co-think with you. And if anyone else has suggestions as well, I don't always have sort of all the perfect answers, but I have noticed that companies were very concerned about before COVID-19. Is it because people have already started asking whether they can work from home before COVID-19, and I have a client, an organizational client, who they felt very concerned. Will people actually do their work? So, and they have been surprised to find that people are producing better work than ever. So the question that I also have is, yes, so I'm aware of the fact that boundaries need to be in place. At home, you also have the rest of your family. Jody, I think recently when we met for the first time virtually, I think I heard some children in the background. I don't know if it was from your home or somewhere else. So one does need some boundaries in place in terms of what are the workspaces in your home, where that need to be respected. What are the time boundaries? Because you still need to have work-life balance. In the new way of working now, these are things that we need to explore. And also, another thing that I'm thinking of is there needs to be some trust, isn't there? In the past, I've heard companies, sometimes watching what time do you come in, what time do you leave, did you arrive on time, did you leave on time? Not so much what have you produced from the time you left till the time you arrived until the time you left. So maybe there needs to be better trust relationships from both sides, Jody, I think, from the organizations and the people that serve those organizations. And then there also needs to be boundaries in terms of what spaces can I work in if I'm not at work, and how can I make sure that I produce the results that the organization requires, and at the same time, I'm not just part of the organizational system, I'm also part of a family system. I'm also have a physical system that I need to look after. I still need to exercise. I need to give time to myself. I need to give time to my families. And I need to make sure that I balance all of that. And I don't know if that, to some extent, answers that question, Jody.
It actually answers that question and another one that Vanessa posed around productivity management. Because as you said, that is going to change significantly now from the situation where, employees were asked to spend certain time, and the measurement was, have you been in the office, did you get to the office by 8, and did you leave at 5? That measure of productivity is going to change into what have you actually done? I think a lot of that, and my sort of next question to you is, how do you take an employee who's worked in that situation for a very long time and is set in that sort of mentality of the 8 to 5 employee, and how do you start coaching that individual to become the productive employee rather than that 8 to 5 employee?
So I love the word that you used, which is coaching, Jody. So, I differentiate between inspired and inspire and motivate. So motivate for me it's an extrinsic concept, in that I want to motivate you to do for me what you need to do for me. Okay, motivation. How do I motivate the employee to produce or to do what they have to do every day? I like the word inspire much more, because inspire is intrinsic, and I always think inspire actually has the word spirit in it. And how do I help someone to find their own internal inspiration to produce what they need to produce? And I think this is where shared purpose, and if you think of the theory U, where we co-sense together, where we together ask, what world do we want for the future? What world do we want to leave for our children? What legacy do we want to leave behind? And what is currently happening? What is currently getting in the way? And what is it that it needs to be replaced by for us to be able to co-create in a new way? And I say us and we, it needs to be collaborative. If we can collaboratively co-sense and co-create and all feel that we have responsibility in doing so, Jody, I want to ask, how would that be different then? If you think about it, if you and I were co-creating and we both feel inspired to make that happen, would anyone have to chase us then to actually do what we need to do to make it happen?
Yeah. No, it speaks to that sort of, one of the concepts that I've been discussing with a lot of people over the last while, I actually had a talk earlier, is that there's the responsibility on both the employer and employee side.
Yes.
The employer to look after his employee, but now, especially going through such a difficult time as we are, the employee to also look after the employer and ensure that the productivity is there and that symbiotic relationship between the two.
Absolutely. And that mutual respect and that mutual accountability. Accountability for self to ensure that I hold myself accountable to co-create what we need to co-create, and also hold one another accountable. If I see, and often the leader has to crack the whip. And how if all of us can actually together hold ourselves and one another accountable to stay true to that shared purpose and to stay true to delivering the shared outcomes. Very, very different to the hierarchical command and control, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think Neil has summed it up nicely in the term ethics. And,
Yes.
I think in that relationship now, more than ever, ethics are, come to the forefront of the relationship between the employer and the employee.
Yes.
In fact, we really need to be disciplined in the way that we go about things and our responsibility towards each other. Um,
Yes.
it's more when we traditionally draw an organogram. You'll draw the employee on top, and you'll have sort of a waterfall effect down. And this relationship is becoming a lot more, from a responsibility perspective, aligned.
And let's take it further, Jody. Let's actually say, so that we're talking about the organization and the employees, right? How about the organization also bringing in their service providers, their suppliers, their clients? And that's that systemic thinking, the looking at the bigger systems. That is what I was talking about earlier on. And let's look at Cyril Ramaphosa again and his government, because they're such a beautiful example. For them to actually get through this time for the greater good of all. And I'm going to actually say to you, Jody, I know we're going to talk about it just now, that there'll be another seminar about looking at it from an individual perspective. But an authentic leader, for me, is someone who's true to themselves, true to their leadership position, with a strong moral underpinning, which resonates. What was it, Neil, that spoke about the ethics? I
Yes,
didn't
it
catch
was.
that. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
For the greater good of all that we serve, and I'm going to talk about that in my next webinar. But if you look at our government at the moment, how they've consulted so widely, they've looked at all their stakeholders, they've consulted, They've asked them for input. They have listened to them. Listening so important. They've listened to uh, um, uh, their social stakeholders, the health community, the economic community, the wider community at large. They've listened internationally. They've consulted. They've listened. They've taken on board, and they have worked together. I get the sense, I don't know about you, I get the sense that everyone at the moment in South Africa is working together beautifully. There doesn't seem to be a what now I must get that word right, politically, you know what I mean? There's no politic playing games here now. It's everyone's pulling together towards a shared purpose, which is to get South Africa health-wise and economically wise through this pandemic. They are working together as one. The whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. So it's looking at who are all our stakeholders that we need to consult, that we depend on, and that we need to look after. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, there's one more. Alan just made a really good point, and it relates to leadership. And he's used the word authentic, and the importance of authenticity as a leadership trait. What is your view on that, Doctor?
It's once again such an interesting question because I always differentiate between authenticity and authentic leadership. So let me ask you, Jody, would you say that Trump is authentic?
In certain respects, yes.
Yes.
I would say so. Yeah.
And would you say that he's a leader?
Trump is definitely a leader.
Okay. Would you say that he's an authentic leader in terms of the definition I gave earlier on? And I'm going to give you the definition again. To be true to
Yeah.
oneself, to be true to one's leadership position with a strong moral underpinning for the greater good that we have been appointed to serve.
Yeah, so definitely not the second part of the description,
Thank you.
but yeah, definitely the first half.
Okay, so that's a difference between authenticity and authentic leadership. Trump might be authentic and he might be a leader, but in terms of if you look at the definitions of authentic leadership today, he's not an authentic leader. So those two are slightly different, and often with my students, this is something that we really, really look at. You can be authentic. With other words, you are true to yourself and whatever it is that you believe and that you think and that and your purpose for yourself, etc. You can be authentic and you might be in a leadership position, but you're not necessarily an authentic leader in terms of serving for the greater good. So when I say serve for the greater good, an authentic leader, in the way it's defined nowadays, they're a leader beyond their leadership position and a leader by presence. In South Africa, Mandela was a really good example of an authentic leader, which doesn't mean to say that they're perfect. It just means that every day they reflect and introspect on who they are, what is required of their leadership position. They introspect on the moral underpinnings and are they serving for the greater good. So authentic leaders are often could be equated to some extent to servant leaders. You are the leader, but you're serving. I mean, would you say that Trump is serving his country?
No, he's definitely not a servant leader.
Yes. Yes, so you see, so I'm in my webinar on the 5th of May. I'm going to be talking about exactly all of these things. But yeah, very, very interesting. And if you look again at Ramaphosa, he definitely, I would say, is, we're seeing his true colors now, aren't we? In this stormy weather, we can really see his true north. And this is what we're talking about, individuals and companies, their true north. During this time, we are seeing, and when I talk about true north, of course, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. it's actually having that compass that keeps you on purpose. And, when the weather's stormy or the seas are stormy, you are able to stay on purpose. And we see that most during times of stormy weather. And that is, we're seeing that in our companies at the moment. We're seeing that in our, so it's our corporate organizations. We're seeing it in our political organizations. We're seeing in the world, we're seeing true colors, aren't we, Jody?
No, we definitely are. We definitely are. Right. Dr. Wulffers, I'm going to have to end our discussion there. We've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank you. This was a really interesting talk. I think you finished it off quite well with that explanation of the authentic leader. Do you have any last words?
Yeah. Okay. So what we spoke about mostly today addresses the outside in and the inside out on a collective level. And I just want to remind us about Confucius and his work, The Great Learning, where he actually said, in order to change the world, I need to first change myself. So the outer landscape often reflects our inner landscape. And I want to remind you of Gandhi's saying, which says, I need to be the change I wish to see in the world. So change needs to start with each one of us. And so I'm going to just say that in the next webinar, I'm going to talk about developing your individual systemic true north in a post-COVID world. And you'll see now my book that was published in 2017, Authentic Leadership Effectiveness for Individuals and Teams, a coaching approach where I look at both individuals and teams and hear from the individuals, how do we build that internal compass? Do we really know who we are and how we've become who we are today and which aspects are working for us and which aspects are limiting us? Have we taken time out to re-examine that? And because it's not just working from the outside in, we've got to work from the inside out as well. And remember, I said to you that authentic leaders are leaders by presence. You don't have to be in a leadership position to be a leader. And at the same time, leadership positions are sometimes filled by people that aren't actually leaders. So I'm going to talk about that on the 5th of May. And so in conclusion, what I want to say is that, the world that our children are inheriting is in crisis in many respects, and it has been on a trajectory that we couldn't sustain. So I think once we are more self-aware and we have that compass that allows us to self-regulate all our decisions and behaviors, then we can start steering true north. And I mean, this COVID pandemic, I want to talk about it. This pandemic has been very traumatic for us, but also it's given us a time to pause, as Otto Sharma says, and to actually start examining. And I'm surprised at how many people have actually really enjoyed this time, and through doing so, we can actually start influencing the systems that we are part of. So just a fun little thing, the grief stages, if you look at grief, which normally the 4 stages are, I'm just thinking about it, it's denial, and then it's anger, and then it's depression, and then it's acceptance. But there's a 5th stage now, and that is meaning. And that stage means that let's actually create meaning out of this pandemic. Let's look at what could that mean for us in a new and different and better way of moving forward. So that's very interesting for me. And I see a lot of people around me doing that, Jody. I don't know if you've experienced that as well. And then in conclusion, our way forward can be beautifully illustrated in a quote that Madiba quoted at his inauguration. It was it's part of a poem called Return to Love by Marianne Williamson. And it says, as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. He quoted that during his inauguration. And that is moving from ego to ecocentric. So, yeah, so if there are any final questions about the organizational true north beyond COVID-19, I still have a few minutes. Otherwise, if people want to contact me directly and ask more about it, they're welcome to do so, Jody. But if there are any further questions, I still have a couple of minutes.
So a lot of, we'll be sharing the video via links that you'll receive on email later this afternoon. So a lot of people have asked about the slides and the video, which we'll share with them. And then Dr. Wulffers will be back on the 5th of May at 2 o'clock with the next webinar. Dr. Wulffers, I'd like to say thank you. We will speak to you again on the 5th of May. It was really enjoyable talking to you.
Thank you for that opportunity, Jody, and I look forward to the 5th of May, and I'm happy to continue with discussions with whomever would like to do that.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wulffers. We'll chat to you soon.
Thank you to
Bye-bye.
you, Jody, and to your attendees. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.